A millionaire forced his son to marry a poor farmer to punish him. But he was stunned by what his son did. The silence in Henry Thompson's grand office was so thick, it felt as if it could be cut with a knife. The polished mahogany desk reflected the dim golden light, while the walls were adorned with awards, medals, and certificates of achievements, all serving as a constant reminder of Henry's towering success and influence. The only sound echoing in the vast space was the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock. Sitting opposite him was his only son, Richard Thompson. His hands gripped the arms of the leather chair, teeth clenched as he tried to withstand the piercing gaze of his father. Henry's glare was not just filled with anger, it was laced with profound disappointment. Breaking the tense silence, Henry finally spoke, his voice steady and cold. "You've exhausted my patience, Richard. Lavish parties, countless women, reckless spending, squandering the fortune I've built with blood, sweat, and sacrifice. You're tarnishing the Thompson name, the legacy I've spent a lifetime creating." Richard let out a dry, defiant laugh, masking the unease stirring inside him. He'd heard these words before, but this time there was something different, a finality, a dangerous edge to his father's tone. "So what now? I'm an adult. I have the right to live my life however I choose, don't I?" Henry's lips curled into a chilling smile. "No, Richard, not anymore. Starting today, it all ends. No more trust fund, no more unlimited credit cards, no more freedom you've so carelessly abused." Richard shot up from his chair, fury flaring in his chest. "You can't do that. I'm not a child you can control anymore." Henry remained composed, his voice unwavering, each word heavier than the last. "Oh, but I can, and I will. But I am giving you one last chance, an opportunity to prove you deserve the Thompson name. You're going to get married." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Richard blinked, stunned, as if struck across the chest. "Married? You're joking, right?" Henry shook his head, gaze unrelenting. "No, Richard, you're going to marry a woman of character. Her name is Emma. She's a farmer in Vermont. You'll live with her on her farm. You'll work, and you'll learn the value of labor and responsibility." Richard scoffed, the sarcasm evident in his voice. "A farmer? You're serious? You expect me to live in the middle of nowhere with some peasant I've never met? This has to be a joke." But Henry's expression didn't waver. "This is no joke, Richard. It's a punishment. And if you refuse, the money stops. The support ends. You'll be completely cut off from the Thompson fortune. You can see how long you last without it." Richard clenched his fists, heart pounding against his ribs. He was being backed into a corner. Everything he'd ever known, his luxury, freedom, and privilege, would vanish if he didn't comply. But the idea of giving it all up, of living like a commoner, was unbearable. "So you're saying I have no choice?" Henry leaned forward, his voice cold as steel. "No. Richard, you leave for Vermont on Monday. I suggest you prepare yourself." 2 days later, Richard found himself standing on a dusty rural road in Vermont, staring at the modest farmhouse where he was now expected to live. The wooden fences were weathered, the white paint peeling from the old house, and the air was so clean it felt foreign. It was a world completely opposite from the luxury he'd always known. As he approached the porch, the front door creaked open, and Emma emerged. She was not what he had expected. She wasn't fragile or delicate. Her chestnut hair was tied back neatly, and her face, though undeniably beautiful, held a stern expression, her sharp blue eyes examining him with quiet intensity. "Richard Thompson?" she asked flatly. Richard nodded, trying to summon his usual confidence, though his voice faltered. "Yes. And you're Emma?" She crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "Yes. Let me be clear. I didn't ask for this arrangement. I don't need your money, and I certainly don't need a spoiled city boy playing house here. I'm doing this because I owe Henry a favor. That's it." Richard bristled, feeling both insulted and challenged, but held his tongue. This wasn't just about labor. It was about facing someone who wouldn't bend to his charm. From the very first day, their marriage was a test of willpower, but neither of them could have predicted how profoundly their lives would be transformed. Richard followed Emma into the modest farmhouse, its simple yet cozy interior a stark contrast to the cold luxury of his Manhattan penthouse. The worn wooden furniture, floral patterned curtains, and a few framed family photos on the walls gave the space a sense of warmth he wasn't accustomed to. The scent of freshly toasted bread and brewed coffee lingered in the air, so ordinary, yet oddly comforting compared to the extravagant lifestyle he once knew. "Your room is at the end of the hallway," Emma said, her voice devoid of warmth as she continued washing freshly harvested vegetables. She didn't even glance back at him, her hands skillfully scrubbing carrots in the old porcelain sink. Richard wordlessly dragged his suitcase down the hallway, stepping into a small room with a single bed, an old wooden wardrobe, and a window overlooking the vast green fields. No luxury sheets, no designer furnishings, just the bare essentials. He dropped his suitcase on the bed and let out a frustrated sigh. To him, this was nothing more than a temporary punishment. All he had to do was play along, prove he was mature, and soon enough, he'd be back to his lavish life. When he returned to the kitchen, Emma was still working in silence, slicing carrots with practiced precision. The sound of the blade hitting the cutting board echoed through the room. Richard folded his arms, leaning against the doorway in an attempt to break the tension. "So, what's the plan here? Are we supposed to play the part of a happily married couple on this farm?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. Emma paused, placing the knife down deliberately before turning to face him. Her blue eyes met his with a steel-like resolve. "We don't have to pretend. We are married, whether you like it or not." Her words hit like a slap to his ego, making his jaw tighten with suppressed anger. "Right, because my father arranged this whole ridiculous setup. And you? You just agreed without question." Emma took a slow breath, her gaze hardening even more. "I didn't have a choice, and neither do you. But let me be clear, this is my home. This farm is everything I have. If you're staying here, you'll work for it. I won't let some spoiled city boy ruin what I've built." Richard raised a brow, forcing a smirk to hide his discomfort. "You think you know me? I've never done anything like this in my life. Then it's time you learn." Emma turned her back to him, resuming her work as if the conversation was already over. The next morning, the sound of roosters crowing jolted Richard awake. His head ached from the restless night, and the stiffness in his body made it clear he wasn't used to sleeping on a basic mattress. The wooden walls felt claustrophobic, the old clock ticking loudly like a constant reminder of his predicament. He longed for the comfort of New York, his silk sheets, his espresso machine, his freedom. A sharp knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Richard, get up. We have work to do." Emma's voice was firm, offering no room for negotiation. Dragging himself out of bed, he slipped into yesterday's clothes, still rumpled from travel, and trudged outside. The crisp Vermont air was far colder than expected, and the sight that greeted him was even more startling. Emma, sleeves rolled up, already hard at work feeding the livestock. Her face was calm, focused, with a streak of dirt on her cheek. She didn't notice him at first, too engrossed in her work. When she finally looked up, she tossed a shovel his way, the wooden handle landing with a thud at his feet. "You're cleaning out the stables today." Richard wrinkled his nose. "You can't be serious." Emma arched a brow, clearly unimpressed. "Serious as a heart attack, now get to it." Without further explanation, she returned to tending the animals. Richard glared at the pile of manure in the stable, the pungent smell already making his stomach turn. This was humiliating. Sweat dripped down his brow as he worked, the relentless task pushing his body far beyond its limits. His back ached, his arms trembled, and the animals seemed to mock him with their blank stares. For a brief moment, the urge to quit overwhelmed him, but Emma's earlier words echoed in his mind. "If you're here, you'll work for it." By late afternoon, after hours of backbreaking labor, Richard finally finished. His clothes were filthy, and exhaustion weighed on every muscle. He slumped onto the porch steps, breathing heavily, the scent of hay and sweat clinging to his skin. Emma approached with a bottle of water and a simple sandwich, placing them beside him without a word. He looked up, half expecting another cold remark, but instead she simply said, "Good job, but this is just the beginning." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar, not just fatigue, but a strange sense of accomplishment. He had worked, truly worked, and the ache in his body was proof of it. And strangely, that feeling wasn't entirely unwelcome. Emma took a deep breath, setting the damp cloth on the counter. Her face showed a hint of exhaustion, but her eyes remained unwaveringly determined. She had lived here her entire life, Yet having Richard in the house for over a month still made it feel as though she was merely tolerating a guest rather than sharing her home with a husband. But for her, this wasn't a punishment. This was life, her life. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but held a sharp clarity. I've spent my whole life on this farm. Richard, it's not a punishment. It's my reality. Richard froze, his sharp blue eyes widening slightly, caught off guard by the firmness in her words. He had never considered it from that perspective. To him, the farm had been a prison sentence, a forced exile, a punishment. But for Emma, it was her entire world. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his dark, slightly disheveled hair. His voice dropped, barely above a whisper. I never asked to be here. Emma crossed her arms, her steady gaze never leaving his face. I know, but you're here now, and if you're going to stay, you need to stop acting like the world owes you something. No one's going to help you stand up if you don't learn to do it yourself. Her words struck deep, cutting straight through his pride. Richard clenched his jaw, the sting of being called out burning inside him. I never asked for anyone's help, but I don't deserve to be treated like I don't matter either. Emma's expression softened, her voice lowering but still holding weight. I'm not treating you like you don't matter. Richard, I'm treating you like a man who needs to learn. You want praise for doing the bare minimum? Life doesn't work that way. The honesty in her words left Richard speechless. She wasn't belittling him, she was speaking the truth. His entire life had been surrounded by validation for the smallest achievements. Wealth had insulated him from hard lessons, from real work, from true accountability. But Emma, she was different. She wasn't going to praise him just to appease his ego. He inhaled deeply, struggling to find words. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter, sincere. I'm trying, Emma. I really am. She studied him carefully, her brown eyes searching his face as if measuring the truth behind his words. Finally, she gave a small nod. I know, but trying isn't enough. You have to mean it, not just as a chore, but because you want to be here. Otherwise, you're just waiting for your chance to run back to your old life. Richard looked away, his gaze drifting to the open fields visible through the window. Did he really want to be here? No, not entirely, but something had shifted. He couldn't deny that. New York, the luxury, the endless parties, it all felt hollow now. Yet he couldn't admit it. Not yet, I guess. We'll see, he murmured, mostly to himself. Emma didn't respond. She simply turned back to the dishes, the tension still lingering between them like an unfinished conversation. The days passed with a steady rhythm. The sun rose early, the work was relentless, and Richard still hated the physical strain, the aching muscles, the dirt under his nails, the scorching sun. But amid the discomfort, something subtle began to change. He noticed the quiet serenity of the mornings when the world was still asleep. The scent of fresh soil, the cool breeze brushing his face as he tended the crops alongside Emma. It was different from the constant noise of New York. The honking cars, the blaring phones, the mindless chatter of social climbers. Here, the silence felt heavy, but not empty. It forced him to think, to confront his own thoughts, his regrets, his failures. One evening, after a long day of cutting hay, Richard sat alone on the porch steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, the fields bathed in the soft, fading light. Emma was tending to the chickens, her silhouette outlined against the sky. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands sure, her focus unwavering. There was a grace in her simplicity that Richard found himself admiring more than he wanted to admit. When she finally returned, their eyes met. For once, neither of them looked away. Emma broke the silence first, sitting beside him on the steps. You're getting better. Her voice was calm but genuine. Richard raised an eyebrow. Better? At shoveling manure, you mean? Her lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. Well, you're less terrible at it. So, progress. A chuckle escaped Richard's lips, surprising even himself. Wow, that's probably the highest compliment you've ever given me. Emma leaned back against the railing, the tension between them easing just slightly. Life here isn't easy. Richard, it tests you. It takes everything you have. I've seen people break under it before. Richard listened closely, sensing the vulnerability in her words. This wasn't just about the farm. It was about her, the weight she carried alone. "I don't know how you do it," he admitted, his voice softer. Emma shook her head gently, her gaze fixed on the fields. "Because if I don't, this place falls apart. My father built this farm. It's my responsibility now. I won't let it disappear." Richard remained silent, digesting her words. For Emma, this farm was more than just land. It was her legacy, her roots, her identity. And for the first time he realized, maybe he had never truly belonged anywhere. Perhaps, in some strange way, this was his chance to find that sense of purpose too. But the question lingered. Was he strong enough to change, to stay? Time would tell. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard stood alone in the middle of the vast field, his muscles aching and his body weary from the long day of labor. Yet for the first time, the weight of failure no longer pressed heavily on his chest. Instead, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment, small but significant enough to make him want to keep trying. Emma approached, a bucket of water in hand. Her voice, calm yet commanding, broke the stillness. "You'll be responsible for the horses from now on. Make sure they're fed and cared for, morning and night." Richard blinked in surprise, absorbing the trust embedded in her words. It wasn't praise, but the responsibility she'd just entrusted him with felt heavier than any compliment he'd ever received. That night, as he lay on the creaky old bed, Richard found himself reflecting on the day's events. Life here wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting, but it felt real. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was contributing to something important, something that mattered beyond his own existence. The thought lingered, quiet yet persistent, like a seed waiting to sprout. The next morning, a storm rolled in without warning. Dark clouds loomed over the sky, casting an ominous gray over the fields. The wind howled, bending trees, and soon, the first drops of rain pounded heavily against the roof. Richard was already outside, securing the stable doors when the downpour intensified. The rain soaked through his clothes, mud splashing up his boots as he worked. Emma's voice cut through the storm, strong and unwavering despite the chaos. "Get the animals inside, quickly." Together, they braved the relentless rain, struggling to herd the animals back into the barn. The horses neighed anxiously, their hooves pounding against the wet earth as thunder rumbled overhead. Rain blurred Richard's vision, but he kept moving, driven by a determination he hadn't felt before. Inside the barn, the wind howled through the cracks, making the lanterns flicker dangerously. The horses were restless, hooves scraping against the wooden floors. Richard secured the last latch, breathing heavily as water dripped from his soaked hair. Emma's voice broke the tense silence. "We need to check the fences. If they're down, the livestock could get out." Richard didn't hesitate. Without a word, both of them sprinted into the storm, the rain pelting their faces like shards of ice. When they reached the far end of the field, their worst fear was confirmed. A section of the wooden fence had collapsed under the force of the wind. "Hold it steady!" Emma shouted, bracing her body against the fallen planks. Richard nodded, heart pounding as he ran back to the shed, returning with nails and a hammer. The wind threatened to rip the fence from his grip, but he held firm. Working side by side, they reinforced the wooden panels, each strike of the hammer echoing through the storm like a battle cry. The rain began to ease just as the final nail was driven in. The fence stood tall once again, soaked, exhausted, and covered in mud. Richard glanced toward Emma. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, her face streaked with rain and dirt. And yet there was something unspoken in her eyes, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The slight nod she gave him was all the acknowledgement he needed. "Let's get inside before we catch pneumonia," she murmured, voice softer now, tinged with exhaustion. Back in the house, the storm had quieted into a gentle drizzle, raindrops pattering against the window panes. Richard knelt by the hearth, lighting the fire as the scent of damp earth lingered in the air. The flames crackled to life, casting a soft, warm glow throughout the room. Emma sat across from him, a blanket draped around her shoulders. They were both silent, the storm's echoes still lingering in their minds. After a while, Emma spoke, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "My father, he passed during a storm just like this one. We lost half our crops that year. I had no choice but to take over the farm after he was gone." Richard looked up, surprised by her sudden vulnerability. He had never asked about her past before, never considered what burdens she might carry. And now, hearing her speak, he realized how much strength it had taken to keep this place running alone. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice sincere. Emma shook her head, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "Don't be. It's just part of life here. You learn to survive, to endure." Richard exhaled, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. He had spent so much of his life chasing wealth and validation, yet none of it had ever felt this meaningful. For the first time, he began to wonder if this farm, this simple, challenging life, could offer him something his privileged world never had, a sense of purpose. And as he glanced back at Emma, he realized something even more profound. Perhaps, amidst the hardship and the rain, he had found not just a new life, but someone worth fighting for. One evening, as the sunset faded, Richard stood silently in the middle of the field, feeling the gentle breeze brushing past him. His muscles ached from a long day of hard work, yet this time, the sensation was no longer one of failure. Instead, it was a sense of accomplishment, small but genuine, that made him want to keep trying. Emma approached, handing him a bucket of water, her gaze firm but calm. "You'll be responsible for the horses from now on. Make sure they're properly cared for, both morning and night." Richard paused for a moment, surprised by the sudden trust she placed in him. Though her words lacked praise, the responsibility alone was enough to spark a sense of pride within him. That night, lying on the old creaky bed, Richard couldn't stop thinking. Life here wasn't glamorous, far from the lavish parties in New York. Yet, working on this farm made him feel like he was truly part of something meaningful. Gradually, the thought of leaving no longer haunted him as it once did. He began to wonder if there could be something deeper to this life. The next morning, a storm arrived without warning. The sky darkened, and strong winds howled through the trees. Richard was already out working when the first drops of rain began to fall. Within moments, the downpour was relentless, turning the ground into slippery mud. Emma rushed toward him, yelling over the storm, "Get them all inside, quickly!" Without hesitation, both of them charged through the rain, feet sinking into the wet earth as they struggled to bring the animals into the barn. The horses whinnied in panic, hooves pounding against the wooden floor. Together, Richard and Emma secured the barn doors, ensuring the animals were safe from the raging storm outside. "We need to check the fence," Emma shouted above the howling wind. The two ran toward the fields where part of the wooden fence had been blown down by the storm. Emma held the broken planks while Richard sprinted back to the shed, returning with a hammer and nails. Rain lashed against their faces, the wind tearing at their clothes as they worked together, reinforcing the damaged fence. Finally, as the rain began to ease, the fence stood strong once again. Richard looked over at Emma, whose gaze had softened. There was a quiet respect in her eyes. No words were exchanged, but the silent nod she gave was more meaningful than any praise he had ever received. "Let's get inside before we both get sick," Emma said softly, her voice laced with exhaustion. Back inside, the storm had subsided into a gentle drizzle, the soft tapping of rain echoing against the windows. Richard knelt by the fireplace, lighting the hearth. Flames crackled to life, filling the room with warmth as the scent of damp earth lingered in the air. Emma sat across from him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The space between them felt different now, less distant, more genuine. After a moment, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "When my father passed, it was during a storm like this. We lost half our crops that year, and since that day, I've carried this farm on my own." Richard looked up, surprised by her vulnerability. He had never thought to ask about her past, never truly considered the weight she bore every day. "I'm sorry," he whispered sincerely. Emma shook her head, offering a small, bittersweet smile. "Don't be. It's just part of life here. You learn to endure." Richard stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. All his life, He had chased wealth and praise, yet none of it had ever felt this real. For the first time, he wondered if this farm, this simple, challenging life, could offer him something his old life never could, a sense of purpose. And as his gaze shifted back to Emma, he realized something even deeper. Perhaps, amidst all the hardship, he had found not just a new way of living, but someone worth fighting for. However, their newfound peace was soon disrupted. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the farmhouse. Henry Thompson stepped out, his expression cold and stern as always. Richard emerged from the porch, bracing himself for the confrontation. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice tense. Henry's sharp eyes scanned the humble property with barely disguised disdain. "I needed to see for myself what made my son turn his back on everything I built." Richard clenched his fists. "I'm not turning my back on anything. I'm choosing a different life." Emma stepped out onto the porch, standing firmly beside Richard, her gaze unwavering as she faced Henry without fear. Henry's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You really think this is real, don't you? This relationship, this farm, you're throwing away everything for a fantasy." Richard inhaled deeply, grounding himself. "Maybe, but it's my choice, and I don't regret it." Henry's expression darkened, his voice lowering dangerously. "If you continue down this path, don't expect a dime from me. You'll be cut off from everything." There was a long pause before Richard responded, his voice calm but resolute. "Then cut me off, because for the first time, I'm choosing what matters to me, not just what you built." Without another word, Henry turned and left, the black car disappearing down the dirt road, leaving Richard and Emma standing together. And in that moment, as the dust settled and the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. Richard stared at Henry, his eyes cold, his voice more determined than ever. "I'm no longer the weak man you once controlled. You may have arranged all of this, but I stayed because I chose to. And now, I choose to stay, because it is my decision." Henry narrowed his eyes, his voice sharp. "You're making a grave mistake, Richard, a serious one." Richard nodded slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Perhaps, but it's my mistake to make." Silence enveloped the space, heavy and tense. Henry stood there, his jaw clenched, furious that Richard was no longer so easily manipulated. But Richard had changed. He was no longer shackled by threats or fear. For the first time, he felt in control of his own life. Finally, Henry turned away, saying nothing more. He walked back to his sleek black car. The engine roared to life, breaking the oppressive silence as the vehicle slowly disappeared down the gravel road, leaving behind only emptiness. Richard turned toward Emma, his chest still tight with unresolved emotions. In the fading sunset, her eyes were tired, holding a sadness mixed with regret. He stood silently for a moment before asking softly, "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "Emma?" She avoided his gaze, her delicate hands twisting together, her voice trembling. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you would leave me. And I couldn't bear to lose you." Richard exhaled deeply, the anger inside him dissipating. He stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his. His voice was soft but firm. "I'm not leaving, Emma. Not now. Not ever." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with vulnerability. "Even after everything that's happened?" He nodded, his voice steady. "Even after everything." The days that followed were quiet. The confrontation with Henry had left scars, emotional wounds not easily healed. His harsh words lingered, and the weight of the truth had left both Richard and Emma shaken. Though the storm had passed, its echoes still lingered. Yet, amidst the pain, something else had begun to grow. A stronger understanding, a quiet determination. Richard knew now that he wouldn't back down from his choice. The farm, once a symbol of his father's punishment, had become something more, a place of purpose. And Emma was no longer just the woman he had been forced to marry. She was the one he couldn't bear to lose. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the fields in shades of gold, Richard found Emma sitting silently on the porch. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the land they had fought so hard to protect. He sat beside her, the silence stretching between them until he finally broke it. "You've been quiet these past few days. Emma, is something wrong?" She didn't answer immediately, only releasing a soft sigh. Her slender shoulders trembled slightly. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with sorrow. I've been thinking a lot about us, how this all started, everything that's happened. I don't know if I can just forget it. I kept the truth from you, and that wasn't fair to either of us. Richard nodded, his heart heavy. I understand, but I also know you didn't do it to hurt me. She met his gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I was scared that if you knew, you'd leave, and I couldn't face that. Richard was silent for a long moment before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma, I stayed here not because of my father, not because of the agreement between us. I stayed because I wanted this. I want us. Her lips trembled, the tears finally spilling over. You have no idea how much that means to me. Richard, he gently brushed his thumb over the back of her hand, his voice steady. I think I do. We've been through so much together, and I know this won't be easy, but I'm ready, as long as you're with me. Emma nodded, her voice trembling. I'm with you, always. They sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The silence between them was no longer empty, but peaceful, filled with quiet promises and unspoken words. As the golden light faded into twilight, it felt as if, for the first time, everything was finally falling into place. Richard whispered softly, for the first time, I feel like I truly belong here. Emma smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. You've changed. Richard, I'm proud of you. You found your place. He looked at her, gratitude swelling in his chest. The farm was no longer a punishment. It was a symbol of growth, of healing. Every repaired fence, every animal cared for, was proof of how far they had come together. And as the sun finally disappeared, they stood there hand in hand, knowing that the challenges were far from over. But now they would face them together, because love, trust, and a shared purpose had become stronger than any storm. Richard knew he had finally found something more valuable than success or wealth. He had found love, and he would never let it go.